The fog pressed against Ravenscroft Manor like a living thing. Inside the darkened drawing room, a woman screamed once, sharp, abruptly silenced. When we found Lady Eleanor, she lay beneath the portrait of her dead child, the silver chain of her sapphire locket buried deep in the pale flesh of her throat. The locket itself had vanished. They said the house was cursed. They said the child's ghost walked again. Hercule Poirot, immaculate even at 3 a.m, surveyed the scene and murmured, "Non, mes amis, it is not a ghost who strangles with such human strength." Chapter 1. The Summons in the Fog. The November morning of 1935 was one of those London mornings that seemed to have been born already tired of themselves. A low jaundiced fog clung to the Thames like a sick man's breath, and even the gulls sounded hoarse. From the window of our flat at Whitehaven Mansions, I could see nothing but a yellowish haze in which lamps burned all day, pale and useless as the eyes of the blind. I, Captain Arthur Hastings, late of His Majesty's Indian Army and now unofficial chronicler to the most extraordinary little Belgian the world has ever seen, was attempting to interest myself in the crossword of the Times when the door of Poirot's bedroom opened with its customary precision. Hercule Poirot entered the sitting room as though he were entering the stage of the Comédie Française. Shoulders back, head erect, the twin points of his mustaches gleaming like the bayonets of a perfectly drilled regiment. He wore a charcoal gray suit of exquisite cut, a waistcoat of dove-gray cashmere, and in the exact center of his crimson silk tie reposed a pearl so large and so perfect that it looked almost insolent. "Bonjour, mon ami," he greeted me, rubbing his small, manicured hands together. "You have the expression of a man who wrestles with the anagram and loses. It is not good for the digestion." Before I could reply, the telephone bell shrilled. Poirot dislikes the telephone intensely. He considers it an instrument of barbarism. Nevertheless, he crossed to the instrument with the resigned air of a duchess lifting her own teacup. "Allô? Oui, c'est Poirot qui parle." His eyebrows ascended like the curtains of a theater. "Comment? Répétez, s'il vous plaît. Ravenscroft Manor? Oui, oui, je comprends. Nous arrivons immédiatement." Who replaced the receiver with the delicacy one might use in setting down a piece of Sèvres porcelain, and turned to me, eyes glittering like green ice. "My friend, pack at once. We depart for Devon. A lady has been murdered, and a locket containing, what do you think, the soul of her dead child has vanished. One does not receive 2 such invitations in a single lifetime." Within 20 minutes, we were in a taxi bowling toward Paddington. Poirot refused to satisfy my curiosity until we were seated in a first-class compartment and the train had lurched out into the fog. Then he drew from his pocket a telegram, much crumpled from rereading. It was addressed to Hercule Poirot, Esquire, Whitehaven Mansions, London W1, and ran as follows. "Lady Eleanor Ravenscroft murdered. Stop locket. Gone. Stop house. Cursed. Stop. Please come at once. Stop. Daphne Wilde." Secretary Ravenscroft Manor, Devon. Poirot tapped the flimsy paper with one manicured finger. "Observe, Hastings. No polite formula, no regret to inform. Only terror. Terror, haste, and most interesting, the word cursed. The English, they do not use such a word lightly. Not in telegrams that cost 9p a word." He leaned back against the cushions, closed his eyes, and began to murmur to himself in rapid French. I caught only fragments. "Une affaire psychologique. Ou bien quelque chose de plus ancien. Le loquet, toujours le loquet." I knew better than to interrupt when the little gray cells were marching. Instead, I watched the fog press its wet face against the window and tried to imagine the scene that awaited us. 10 years earlier, I had met Lady Eleanor Ravenscroft once, at a charity ball in aid of distressed gentlewomen. Even then, though not yet 40, she had the tragic beauty of a Burne-Jones angel. Tall, pale, with hair the color of autumn beech leaves and eyes the violet blue of wood smoke. Her husband, Sir Gerald Ravenscroft, had died in the spring of 1925 of wounds sustained at Ypres. 6 months later, their only child, little Amelia, followed her father after a cruel fever. Society whispered that Lady Eleanor had never truly returned from that double grave. She had shut herself up in the ancient family seat on the edge of Dartmoor, and was seen no more in London. And now it seemed someone had murdered her for a locket. The train crawled southward all day. At Exeter St. David's, a sleek Rolls-Royce Phantom 3, black as a hearse, waited on the forecourt. The chauffeur touched his cap. "Miss Wilde's compliments, sir. She thought you would prefer not to rely on the branch line." Poirot inclined his head with regal approval. "The young lady shows the consideration. En avant!" We swept out of Exeter, and almost at once the moor swallowed us. The road climbed between granite tors that loomed suddenly out of the fog like prehistoric monsters. Skeletal oaks clawed at the sky. Here and there a ruined tin mine engine house stood gaunt against the racing clouds. I have never felt England so old, so savage, so indifferent to man. At last, as dusk began to drain what little light remained, the car turned between tall gateposts, surmounted by stone ravens with spread wings. The drive twisted for nearly a mile through an avenue of rhododendrons gone wild, their dark leaves glistening like the scales of serpents. Then abruptly the house appeared. Ravenscroft Manor was not beautiful. It was magnificent in the way a wounded animal is magnificent. Huge, untamed and faintly menacing. Built in the flamboyant Gothic of the 1860s, it reared 3 stories of mullioned windows and fantastic chimneys against a sky the color of old bruises. Every detail seemed designed to remind the beholder of mortality. Gargoyles leered from the eaves, stone ravens perched on every corner, and above the entrance porch a Latin inscription had been carved deep into the granite. Mors janua vitae, death is the gate of life. The rolls crunched to a halt on wet gravel. Before the chauffeur could open the door, the great iron-studded portal swung inward and a young woman appeared on the steps. She was perhaps 23, tall and slender, dressed in severe black that made her pale face almost luminous. Her hair, the color of ripe wheat, was drawn back into a knot at the nape of her neck, but one rebellious strand had escaped to curl against her cheek. Her eyes were the same violet blue I remembered in Lady Eleanor, and for one startled instant I thought I was seeing a ghost. "Mr. Poirot, Captain Hastings?" Her voice was low, but it shook. "I am Daphne Wilde. Thank you more than I can ever say, for coming so quickly." Poirot bowed over her hand with exquisite courtesy. "Mademoiselle, it is we who are honored that you should place your trust in Hercule Poirot." She led us into a vaulted entrance hall where a log fire struggled against the damp. Armor stood in the corners like hollow sentinels. A grandfather clock ticked with the slow, deliberate stroke of a funeral bell. Somewhere high above us a door slammed, though there was no draft. Miss Wilde noticed my involuntary start. "The house does that," she said, attempting a smile that failed. "It breathes." Lady Eleanor used to say Ravenscroft was alive and did not always wish us well. She took us up a vast oak staircase lit by a single electric bulb that swung gently, though no one had touched it. Portraits of long-dead Ravenscrofts glared down at us, men in the armor of Christie, women in the farthingales of Elizabeth, admirals in gold lace, judges in scarlet and ermine. Every face bore the same high cheekbones, the same arrogant raven's beak nose. At the turn of the stair hung a more recent portrait, Lady Eleanor in court dress, diamonds flashing at her throat, and on her bosom the famous sapphire locket, large as a walnut, dark as a midnight sea, surrounded by brilliance that shivered with cold fire. Poirot paused before it. "So that is the famous locket," he murmured. "One understands the obsession." Miss Wilde's voice dropped to a whisper. She never removed it. Not in 10 years. Not to bathe, not to sleep. She truly believed that when Amelia died, she captured the child's soul in the sapphire at the moment of death. A medium in London told her it could be done. She paid a king's ransom for that stone. And now, Poirot said softly, both lady and locket are gone. We reached the long gallery. Through tall windows the fog pressed close, turning the world beyond to gray nothing. Halfway along, a door stood ajar. Even from a distance I could see the chalked outline on the floor where a body had lain. Miss Wilde halted as though an invisible hand had been placed upon her breast. She was found just there, she said, at midnight. Mrs. Inglethorpe heard the scream. Only one. Then silence. Poirot's gaze was very gentle. And you, mademoiselle, where were you? I slept, at the far end of the corridor. I heard nothing until Mrs. Inglethorpe hammered on my door. When we reached her, Lady Eleanor was already dead. The chain had been used to... She pressed a hand to her mouth. Poirot laid a small, reassuring hand on her arm. Courage, mon enfant. Tell me of the locket. It was taken from her neck after death? During, she whispered. The chain was embedded so deeply that there were 2 grooves in the flesh. Someone tore it away while she still struggled. A silence fell, broken only by the endless ticking of the clock below and the soft drip of water somewhere in the walls. Poirot turned to the open door. May one see? She nodded, unable to speak. We stepped into what had been Lady Eleanor's bedroom. It was a room that seemed to have withdrawn into itself, as though grieving. The great 4-poster bed was still unmade, the sheets twisted as though in agony. On the carpet, the chalked outline of a woman lay like an obscene shadow. Above the mantel, a portrait of little Amelia. Golden curls, trusting eyes smiled down upon the place where her mother had died. Poirot moved about the room with the silent concentration I had seen so often before. He examined the windows, fastened, the fireplace, cold, the carpet, no traces of mud or ash. He opened drawers, studied the contents of a crystal bottle on the dressing table, lifted and replaced a silver-backed hairbrush. Finally, he stood beneath the portrait of the child and clasped his hands behind his back. Tell me, mademoiselle, he said without turning, who inherits Ravenscroft now that the locket, and whatever it contained, is gone? For the first time, something almost like fear flickered across Daphne Wilde's face. I do not know. There was an old will and then a new one 3 weeks ago. Lady Eleanor burned the new one herself the very day before she died. She laughed as it burned, said the flames would not harm Amelia's soul. Poirot spun on his heel. She burned it? In this grate? Yes. I saw the ashes myself. He knelt swiftly, seized the poker, and began raking among the dead cinders. After a moment, he gave a small exclamation of satisfaction and held up a fragment no larger than a postage stamp, thick vellum, the corner of a seal still visible in crimson wax. Tiens, he said softly. A corner that escaped the flames. Observe the arms, the raven volant of the Ravenscrofts. This was indeed a testament. He rose and looked at the chalked outline, then at the portrait above. Somewhere in this house, he said, there is a murderer who believes himself or herself safe because a document is destroyed and a sapphire prison has vanished into the night. Somewhere there is a person who strangled a woman with the very chain that was supposed to protect her immortal soul. He turned to Daphne Wilde, and for the first time his voice held the ring of steel. Mademoiselle, you will present me within the hour to every person who slept beneath this roof on the night Lady Eleanor died, and you will tell them that Hercule Poirot has arrived, and that he does not believe in ghosts. Far away in the depths of the house, a clock began to strike 6. The notes fell into the fog like drops of blood into water. Somewhere, a child began to laugh. Chapter 2. The 5 who remained dinner that first night was a grim, silent affair. The vast dining room, lit only by a chandelier whose candles guttered in the draught, seemed to swallow sound of knives and forks on Wedgwood china. Nobody spoke. The 5 survivors of the household sat like statues around the mahogany desert, occasionally darting glances at one another that were equal parts fear and suspicion. Dr. Miles Trevelyan, seated at Lady Eleanor's right, where he had sat every night for the past 5 years, kept his eyes fixed on his untouched plate. He was perhaps 40, dark-haired, with the kind of good looks that border on weakness. A mouth too sensitive, eyes too restless. Every few moments his long surgeon's fingers drummed a silent tattoo on the damask cloth. I noticed a faint stain of iodine on his cuff and caught again that unmistakable whiff of ether that seemed to cling to him like an accusing ghost. Opposite him, Colonel Reginald Blake attacked his mutton as though it had personally insulted the regiment. He was a big, florid man in his late 50s with a mustache that bristled like a bayonet charge and a scarlet tunic that strained across a corporation built on mess port whiskey and inaction. He had arrived from Kenya 6 months earlier, ostensibly to look after the estate, but everyone knew he had been sent down from his club for unpaid gambling debts. His eyes, small and red-rimmed, flicked continually toward the empty chair at the head of the table. Mrs. Inglethorpe, presiding over the servants' end with the rigid dignity of a dowager empress, served the food herself. The other maids had been given the evening off or had taken it. 50 years in the house had turned her into something between a priestess and a jailer. Her black bombazine dress rustled like dry leaves, and her keys, those eternal keys, jangled at her waist whenever she moved. She had not wept, not once, since the murder. Her face was a mask carved from granite. Daphne Wilde sat beside me. She ate nothing. Her hands lay in her lap, knuckles white. Once or twice I saw her lips move as though in prayer, but no sound came. At 9 o'clock precisely, Poirot rose. "Mesdames et messieurs," he announced, "if you would be so kind as to join me in the library. Hercule Poirot has certain questions." They obeyed as though pulled by strings. The library was a magnificent room running the full depth of the West Wing, lined floor to ceiling with calf-bound volumes that no one had opened in 50 years. A huge fire crackled on the hearth, throwing restless shadows across the Persian rugs. French windows opened onto the terrace, but tonight the fog pressed against the panes like a living thing trying to get in. Poirot took up his position with his back to the fire, hands clasped behind him, the flames making a halo of his impeccably slicked hair. I stood at his elbow. The 5 arranged themselves in a semicircle, Trevelyan in a leather wing chair, Blake standing aggressively with legs apart as though on parade, Mrs. Inglethorpe bolt upright on a tapestry stool, Daphne on the edge of a sofa, and unexpectedly, young Tom the footman who had slipped in through the service door and now hovered in the shadows like a nervous colt. Poirot wasted no time on preliminaries. Lady Eleanor Ravenscroft was murdered between 11:30 and midnight last night. The weapon was her own silver chain, the chain from which hung the celebrated sapphire locket. The locket has disappeared. These are facts. Now we shall examine motives, opportunities, and most important, the psychology of the crime. He let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. 3 weeks ago, he continued softly, Lady Eleanor executed a new will. Dr. Trevelyan, you drafted it, I believe? The doctor started as though stung. Yes. At her request. She wished to leave the bulk of her estate to medical research. specifically to my sanatorium project for shell-shocked officers. Yet the day before yesterday, she burned that will in her bedroom grate and declared her intention of reverting to the old one of 1925, which left everything to her brother-in-law, Colonel Blake, in trust for any possible heirs of the body. Poirot's eyes glittered. You were present when she burned it, Docteur. Trevelyan's tongue touched his lips. I was. And you attempted to dissuade her? She was not rational. The hallucinations had returned worse than ever. Childish laughter in the corridors, footsteps in the nursery, writing appearing on the schoolroom slate. Mummy let me in. She believed Amelia walked again. I increased the laudanum, but... Yet the locket that supposedly contained Amelia's soul protected her from harm. Poirot interrupted gently. Curious, is it not, that the one night the locket failed was the night someone strangled her with its chain? Colonel Blake could contain himself no longer. He slammed a meaty fist into his palm. Damned if I'll listen to this poppycock. The house is haunted, sir. Always has been. My brother Gerald saw things, lights on the moor, ravens that spoke with human voices. And now Amelia's come back because her mother tried to give away her inheritance to a lot of damned quacks. Mrs. Inglethorpe spoke for the first time. Her voice was low. East London refined by decades of service into something colorless and terrible. Little Miss Amelia was always a willful child. When she wanted something, she got it. Even now. Daphne made a small, choked sound. Poirot raised a hand. We shall examine the supernatural later. For the moment, let us consider the practical. Who had the opportunity? The corridor outside Lady Eleanor's room is long and drafty. Her scream was heard only by Mrs. Inglethorpe, whose room is directly opposite. Yet Mrs. Inglethorpe swears she saw no one. The housekeeper's chin lifted. I sleep light, always have. I heard my lady cry out once, only once, and I was at her door in moments. It was locked. By the time Tom fetched the master key from my bunch, she was beyond help. Tom shuffled forward, cap in hand. Begging your pardon, sir, but I saw Summit, night before last. A figure in white drifting across the lawn toward the family chapel. Looked like a child. I told her ladyship, and she gave me the sack for spreading tales. Poirot's gaze swept over them all like green fire. So, we have a doctor who loses a fortune, a colonel who gains one, a housekeeper who hears only what she wishes, a secretary who... He paused delicately. Who perhaps expected recognition at last, and a footman who sees ghosts. Excellent. The classic closed circle. He turned toward the door. And now, if you please, I will see the bedroom again, by lamplight this time. We filed out into the hall. The great staircase rose into darkness like the backbone of some prehistoric beast. Halfway up, Poirot paused dramatically. Listen! From the shadows above came the voice of a child, clear, sweet, heartbreaking. Mummy, why won't you let me in? The words floated down the stairwell, echoed along the gallery, and died away into a sob. Daphne screamed once, a thin, tearing sound. Trevelyan went the color of tallow. Even Blake's mustache seemed to droop. I felt the hair rise on my neck. Poirot alone remained unmoved. He clicked his tongue with mild irritation. Tiens, the acoustics of these old houses magnificent. Speaking tubes, without doubt. Or perhaps something even more primitive. He started upward again, cane tapping briskly. Come, my friends, the child calls. Let us discover whether she is flesh or merely malice. And from the darkness above, very softly, came childish laughter. Chapter 3. The Room That Remembered. The morning after our arrival dawned no brighter than the night had been. A thin, sour light filtered through the fog, turning Ravencroft Manor the color of old bone. I woke with the taste of damp in my mouth and the echo of that childish laughter still ringing in my ears. Poirot, of course, was already immaculate, shaved, pomaded, and dressed as though for a reception at Buckingham Palace. He regarded my rumpled appearance with mild disapproval. "Come, Hastings, the little grey cells functionent pas sur un estomac vide, but today we must breakfast on crime." We descended to a breakfast room where the sideboard groaned under silver dishes that no one touched. Only Daphne Wilde was there, pale and silent, crumbling a piece of toast as though it had offended her. She looked up as we entered. "Dr. Trevelyan has not come down," she said. "He spent the night in the library with a bottle of brandy. Colonel Blake is walking on the moor. Says he needs to clear his head. Mrs. Inglethorpe is praying in the chapel." Poirot helped himself to a single boiled egg with the precision of a surgeon. "Excellent. Then we shall visit the scene of the crime while the house is quiet. Lead on, mademoiselle." Daphne hesitated, then rose like someone walking in her sleep. We followed her up the great staircase and along the long gallery. The portraits seemed to watch us with increased malevolence in the grey light. I could have sworn the eyes of little Amelia in her frame followed our progress. Lady Eleanor's bedroom door stood ajar exactly as we had left it. The chalk outline on the turkey carpet had been smudged slightly. Someone had walked there since last night. But the shape was still horribly clear. A woman flung backward, arms outstretched as though in supplication. The room smelled of lavender water overlaid with something sweeter and more terrible, the faint, clinging odor of death. The great four-poster bed dominated everything, its crimson hangings still drawn back exactly as the murderer had left them. The sheets were twisted into ropes. One pillow lay on the floor where it had been hurled or clutched in a final spasm. Poirot stood in the doorway for a full minute, perfectly still, absorbing the atmosphere like a sponge. Then he moved forward with that characteristic glide that always reminded me of a cat stalking a particularly interesting mouse. He began at the bed. With delicate fingers, he smoothed the counterpane, examined the indentations in the mattress, lifted the pillows one by one. From beneath the lower pillow, he drew out something that glinted, a single long auburn hair. "Lady Eleanor's?" I asked. "No. See? Coarser, and the color is darker at the root. Someone else lay here recently. Someone who dyes her hair, perhaps." His eyes flicked meaningfully toward the door where Daphne stood frozen. The girl touched her wheat gold head instinctively. I sometimes read to her when she could not sleep. She liked me to sit on the bed." Poirot merely nodded and passed on to the dressing table. He opened the jewel box, empty as we knew, then the drawers beneath. In the second drawer, he found a small brown medicine bottle with a typed label, Laudanum, Tinctura OP, Dr. M. Trevelyan. The bottle was half empty. "Powerful stuff," I muttered. "Powerful enough to fell an ox if administered in sufficient quantity," Poirot replied grimly. Yet the glass on the bedside table contained only a residue. Curious. He moved to the fireplace. The ashes were cold, but he poked among them anyway, producing another tiny fragment of vellum, the twin to the one he had found yesterday. "The will burns poorly," he murmured. "Paper of the finest quality always resists the flame." Then he knelt, actually knelt on the exact spot where Lady Eleanor's head had lain. With a magnifying glass, he examined the links of the invisible chain that had killed her. After a moment, he gave a small crow of satisfaction. "Regardez, Hastings, fibers, green wool caught in the filigree work of the clasp, and here," he pointed with a pencil, "a single thread of darker still, almost black. Someone wore a green dressing gown, and something else." I remembered instantly. Trevelyan. I saw him in the hall last night wearing a green quilted thing, and his scarf. He had a black silk scarf. Précisément. But Poirot was not finished with the floor. He rose and crossed to the mantelpiece where the photograph of Lady Eleanor with little Amelia stood in its silver frame. The child was laughing, one dimpled hand reaching toward the camera. The mother's face was radiant with a joy that now seemed obscene in this room of death. Poirot lifted the photograph down gently, almost reverently. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written, "To my darling Amelia, who holds my heart in her tiny hands. Forever." He replaced it and turned to the window. The casement was fastened, but when he threw it open, the fog rolled in like smoke. 20 feet below, the gravel path glistened with wet. And there, directly beneath the window, was the print of a child's shoe, small, perfect, pointing toward the house. I felt my skin crawl. Poirot. That was not there yesterday. It was there, he corrected quietly, but the fog preserved it. Regard the depth, too deep for the weight of a real child. Someone pressed a child's shoe into the gravel deliberately, but why? Daphne made a small sound in her throat. She used to stand here sometimes, she whispered. Lady Eleanor, at night, she said she could feel Amelia trying to climb back in. She would open the window and call into the darkness. Poirot closed the window with a sharp click. Enough! We deal with a murderer who understands the power of suggestion. The print is a message, or a warning. He moved to the wardrobe and flung it open. Dresses hung in regimented rows, all black or violet since Amelia's death. On the floor lay a pair of indoor shoes, Lady Eleanor's, with damp gravel still clinging to the soles. She went to the window herself that night, Poirot said. After taking the laudanum, perhaps, or before the murderer entered. She was waiting for her child. He stood in the center of the room, hands clasped behind his back, turning slowly like a compass needle seeking north. This room remembers everything, he said at last. It remembers laughter and lullabies and the scent of nursery talc. It remembers fever and prayers and the sound of a small coffin being nailed shut. And now it remembers violence. But memory can be distorted, n'est-ce pas? Someone has been encouraging these memories. He crossed suddenly to the wall beside the fireplace and pressed his ear to the paneling. After a moment he tapped. Once, twice. A hollow sound answered. A priest's hole, or something more modern? His fingers found a concealed spring. A small panel slid aside, revealing a narrow shaft lined with metal, a speaking tube, its mouthpiece carved like a grinning fawn. Ah, the voice of the child explained. From the corridor outside came running footsteps. Mrs. Inglethorpe burst in, cap askew, face blanched. Sir, Mr. Poirot, come quickly. Dr. Trevelyan, he's locked himself in the gun room and won't answer. The colonel's breaking down the door. Poirot's eyes gleamed like winter stars. Then let us hurry, mon ami. I think the good doctor is about to make a confession, whether he wishes to or not. And from the speaking tube behind us, very faintly, came the sound of a child beginning to cry. Chapter 4. The Doctor's Confession. The corridor seemed to pulse with our footsteps as we tore along the gallery, down the servants' stair, and across the flagstoned passage that led to the gun room. Colonel Blake was there already, face purple with rage, hurling his 14-stone bulk against the stout oak door. Each impact shook the walls and sent flakes of plaster drifting down like dandruff from an ancient ceiling. "Open up, you damned coward!" he roared. "Come out and face what you've done!" Mrs. Inglethorpe hovered behind him, wringing her hands, her keys jangling frantically. Daphne Wilde had followed us. She stood white and trembling, one hand pressed to her mouth. Poirot arrived last, unhurried, but his eyes were bright with that particular excitement I had learned to recognize. The hunter who has scented blood. "Gently, mon colonel," he admonished. The door is 18th century. It will not yield to brute force, and we do not wish Dr. Trevelyan to put a bullet through his brain before he has enlightened us." Blake rounded on him, veins standing out like cords on his forehead. "Enlightened us? The man's guilty as sin, locked himself in with the guns, classic murderer's conscience." Poirot ignored him. He stepped forward, placed his mouth close to the keyhole, and spoke in a calm, almost soothing voice. "Dr. Trevelyan, it is Hercule Poirot. You are not alone. Whatever darkness possesses you, it is better shared. Open the door. I give you my word you will not be harmed." Silence. Then a sound, half laugh, half sob, from the other side. The key turned with a screech of rust. The door swung inward. Dr. Trevelyan stood in the center of the gun room like a man awaiting execution. The room smelled of gun oil, leather, and brandy. Cabinets of shotguns and rifles lined the walls. Heads of long-dead stags stared glassily from the panels. On the table lay an open bottle of Armagnac, half empty, and beside it a Webley service revolver. Trevelyan's face was ghastly. His hair was disheveled, his tie askew, and his eyes, those restless surgeon's eyes, were red-rimmed and wild. "I didn't kill her," he said hoarsely. "I swear by all that's holy, I loved her." Poirot entered slowly, motioning the rest of us to remain in the doorway. He picked up the revolver, broke it, and slipped the cartridges into his pocket with the neatness of a conjurer. "Then let us talk of love, Doctor, and of laudanum, and of wills." He guided Trevelyan to a leather armchair, sat him down like a child, and took the opposite seat. The rest of us crowded in. Even Blake subsided, though he kept his fists clenched. Trevelyan reached for the brandy with shaking fingers. Poirot allowed it. "Begin at the beginning," the little Belgian said gently. "When did you first become Lady Eleanor's lover?" Trevelyan flinched as though struck, but the question had its desired effect. He began to talk, the words tumbling out like poison finally lanced. 3 years ago, she was breaking. The anniversaries, Gerald's death, then Amelia's, each year worse. She heard the child crying at night. She saw her in mirrors. I was her physician, yes, but also her only companion. One night she begged me to stay after I had given her her dose. She was terrified to be alone. I stayed, and on comfort became something more. He drank deeply. I told myself I was helping her, that love would heal what medicine could not. But I lied to myself. I wanted Ravencroft. I wanted the money for my sanatorium, proper treatment for men like Blake here, broken by the war. Eleanor promised it to me. The new will was to be signed the day after she burned the old one. Then something changed. Poirot leaned forward. "The locket," Trevelyan laughed, a dreadful cracked sound. "Yes, the damned locket. She became convinced it no longer protected her, that Amelia was angry because she had tried to give away the child's inheritance. She said the stone had grown cold, that the soul inside was turning away from her. She wanted to make a new will, leaving everything to charity, to the church, anywhere but to me. She said material things belonged to the living, and she was ready to join her daughter." He buried his face in his hands. "I increased the laudanum. I told her it would quiet the voices, but they only grew louder. She began to suspect me, suspect that I was keeping her drugged so she would not change the will back. The night she died, she sent for me. She was feverish, half mad. She said she knew what I had been using the speaking tubes to imitate Amelia's voice, trying to drive her completely over the edge so the will would stand. She laughed at me, said Amelia had told her everything." Blake made a strangled noise. "You admit it, then? You staged the haunting?" Trevelyan lifted his head. There were tears on his cheeks, but his eyes were defiant now. "Yes, God help me, yes, the tubes, the writing on the slate, the cold hands touching her in the dark, all me. I thought if she believed the child wanted her to keep the new will, she would sign it again. But she discovered the truth. She said she would expose me. She tried to ring for Mrs. Inglethorpe. I caught her hands. I only meant to calm her. She scratched me. Look! He pulled down his collar. 4 parallel scratches, fresh scabbed, marred the side of his neck. We struggled. She fell back onto the bed. The chain of the locket was in my hand. I don't even remember taking it. She was screaming, silently because of the drug. I pulled the chain tight to keep her quiet, just for a moment, just until she stopped fighting. His voice broke completely. When I let go, she was still. The room was utterly silent. Poirot's voice, when he spoke, was cold as winter iron. And the locket itself? I took it. I thought it contained the new will, the one favoring me. She had always said there was a secret compartment. I fled through the window, down the ivy. I meant to pry it open in my room, but when I finally forced it, he reached into his pocket and drew out the sapphire, dull now in the morning light. There was nothing. Only Amelia's miniature portrait and a lock of baby hair. Nothing else. He held it out, dangling from its broken chain like a dead thing. Poirot took it, turned it over in his small hands. You killed her for a phantom legacy, he said quietly. And you invented ghosts to hide your guilt. But you are not the only one who has played at haunting, n'est-ce pas? Non, doctor, you are merely the most obvious. The red herring that stinks so strongly it distracts from the true predator. Trevelyan stared at him, bewildered. What do you mean? I've confessed everything. Poirot rose. You have confessed your forgeries, your drugs, your manslaughter, perhaps. But the strangulation, it was deliberate, premeditated. Those bruises on her throat were not the marks of panic. They were the marks of hatred. And hatred, doctor, requires a deeper motive than disappointed greed. He turned to the rest of us, eyes blazing. Someone else entered that room after you fled, doctor. Someone who finished what you began. And that someone is still among us. From the corridor came the sound of a child singing, a nursery rhyme, soft and sweet and utterly malignant. Oranges and lemons, say the bells of St. Clement's. When will you pay me? Say the bells of Old Bailey. When I grow rich, say the bells of Shoreditch. Here comes a candle to light you to bed, and here comes a chopper to chop off your head. The voice faded into silence. Colonel Blake's face had gone, the revolver out again, though he had no idea where to point it. Poirot alone smiled, a small, terrible smile. Chip. Chop, chip, chop, the last man's dead. Chapter 5. The Secretary's Secret. After the scene in the gun room, the house seemed to hold its breath. Dr. Trevelyan was locked in his bedroom under the watchful eye of Colonel Blake, who had appointed himself jailer with a grim satisfaction that bordered on glee. The doctor had collapsed completely once the locket was taken from him. He lay on the chaise longue, muttering about blue stones and children's fingers clawing at his soul. Mrs. Inglethorpe had dosed him with bromide and drawn the curtains as though darkness itself could cure what ailed him. Poirot, however, was far from satisfied. "Non, Hastings," he murmured as we left the gun room. "The good doctor is a criminal, yes, a forger of hauntings, a seducer, perhaps even a man guilty of involuntary manslaughter. But murderer? No. The hands that pulled that chain tight enough to leave 2 perfect grooves in the flesh were steady hands. Hands that hated. Trevelyan loved her in his weak, selfish fashion. Someone else hated. Then who? I demanded. Poirot tapped his temple. Patience, mon ami. First, we must speak with Mademoiselle Daphne. There is a secret in her eyes that wishes to be born. We found her in the nursery. The room was at the very top of the house, up a narrow staircase that creaked like old bones. No one had entered it in 10 years, yet it was spotless, Mrs. Inglethorpe's devotion or her superstition. The door opened with a sigh, as though the room had been waiting. It was a child's paradise frozen in time. Pale blue walls papered with scenes from Beatrix Potter, Peter Rabbit frozen mid-hop, Jemima Puddle Duck forever sailing her puddle. A rocking horse with real horsehair mane stood in the corner, one glass eye catching the thin light like a tear. Dolls sat in a solemn circle for a tea party that would never end. Their porcelain faces smiled with the vacant sweetness of the dead. On the mantel, a Noah's Ark of carved animals marched 2 by 2 toward a painted ark whose doors stood open, waiting for a flood that had already come. Daphne Wilde sat in the window seat, knees drawn up, staring out at the fog-shrouded moor. She did not turn when we entered, but her reflection in the glass was pale and composed. "You knew I would come here," she said quietly. Poirot closed the door with exquisite care. "Mais oui, mademoiselle, the nursery calls to you as it called to your mother." She flinched as though he had struck her, then slowly unfolded herself and stood. In the cold light she looked extraordinarily young, and extraordinarily like the portrait of little Amelia, grown up. The same violet eyes, the same delicate bones. "How long have you known?" she asked. "From the first moment I saw you beside the portrait in the gallery," Poirot replied. "The Ravencroft nose, it is unmistakable. And the eyes. Ah, those eyes. They are not the eyes of a secretary, they are the eyes of a daughter." She laughed then, a small, broken sound. "A daughter, yes, though never acknowledged. My real name is Daphne Ravencroft. I was born in Switzerland in a clinic paid for by Sir Gerald's solicitor. Lady Eleanor was told the child, me, had died. She believed it for 11 years. Then one day in 1932, a letter came, anonymous. It told her I lived, that I had been adopted by a childless couple in Devon who later died, leaving me penniless. She traced me, offered me the position of secretary, brought me here, to watch over me, and to decide whether I was real." Poirot's voice was very gentle. "And the locket?" Daphne crossed to a small bureau and opened the bottom drawer. From it she drew a folded paper yellowed with age. "She showed me this the night she died, my birth certificate, the original with both their signatures, Sir Gerald and Lady Eleanor. She had kept it hidden in the locket all these years in the secret compartment behind Amelia's miniature. She said she was going to acknowledge me publicly. Change the will again, this time in my favor. She was going to give me Ravencroft, everything." Her voice cracked. "But someone found out, someone who could not bear a bastard daughter to inherit." Poirot took the certificate, studied it gravely. "And you heard nothing that night? No struggle, no scream?" "I heard something. A cry, quickly muffled. I was in my room waiting for her to ring for me as she often did when the nightmares came. By the time I reached her door, it was locked from the inside. Mrs. Inglethorpe was already there, hammering. When we finally entered..." She pressed both hands to her face. "The locket was gone. The one proof of who I am. Gone. Now I am only the secretary again, the interloper." Poirot moved to the schoolroom slate that stood on its easel in the corner. Fresh chalk marks stood out white against the black. "You should have died instead of Amelia." The letters were large, childish, shaking. Daphne stared at them. "That wasn't there yesterday." "No," Poirot said softly. "It was written this morning, while we were with the doctor." He wiped the slate clean with his handkerchief. Beneath the fresh chalk, faint impressions remained, deeper, adult pressure. Someone had pressed hard to make the message look like a child's. "Someone wishes you to believe Amelia resents you," Poirot said. "Someone who knows the power of guilt in this house." He opened the toy cupboard. Inside, among the dolls and wooden bricks, lay something that made my blood run cold. A child's shoe, small patent leather still bearing traces of wet gravel from the path below Lady Eleanor's window. Daphne's breath caught. She kept them, she whispered. Amelia's shoes. After the fever, she couldn't bear to part with anything. Poirot turned it over. The sole was freshly muddied. Someone borrowed Amelia's shoe last night, he said, to make footprints for us all to see, to make us believe the child walks. He replaced the shoe exactly as he had found it and closed the cupboard. Tell me, mademoiselle, did Lady Eleanor ever speak of destroying this certificate? Daphne shook her head. She said she would have it framed, that she would hang it beside Amelia's portrait so we could both be her daughters at last. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Then the murderer took more than a sapphire. They took your birthright, and they are not finished. He moved to the window. The fog was lifting slightly. I could just see the family chapel in the grounds, its stone angels weeping green tears of lichen. Someone in this house has hated you for 11 years, mademoiselle. Someone who believed themselves the true heir, or the guardian of the true heir's memory. From the corridor came the sound of hurried footsteps. Mrs. Inglethorpe appeared in the doorway, cap askew, face drained of color. "Sir, the doctor, he's gone. Window open, ivy torn away in great strips. There's blood on the sill, and this—" She held out a torn scrap of green quilted silk, dark with blood. Poirot took it gravely. Dr. Trevelyan has fled into the moor, with his scratches and his guilt and his laudanum dreams. But he did not write on the slate this morning. No. Someone wishes us to believe he did. He turned back to Daphne. Lock your door tonight, ma petite. The ghosts in this house are growing bold. As we left the nursery, the rocking horse began to rock. Slowly, rhythmically, though no hand touched it. Or so it seemed. Far below in the hall, the grandfather clock began to strike 3. And from somewhere very close came the whisper of a child. Chip, chop, chip, chop. The last man's dead. But this time the voice was not in the speaking tube. This time it was directly behind us. Chapter 6. The Ivy That Lied. The fog lifted just enough that afternoon to reveal the moor as a sodden, khaki-colored waste stretching away to the grim tors on the horizon. Poirot insisted we go outside immediately, while the ground still remembers, as he put it. I would have preferred a roaring fire and a whiskey and soda after the morning's dramatics. But when Hercule Poirot is on the scent, one does not dawdle. We stood beneath Lady Eleanor's bedroom window. The gravel path was still damp, gravel was still there, but the child's footprint had been obliterated, either by the drizzle or more likely by deliberate scuffing. Poirot knelt, heedless of his immaculate spats, and began his familiar ritual. Magnifying glass, tweezers, small envelopes for evidence. I kept watch, feeling rather like a retriever waiting for the stick. Nothing? I said at last. Whoever made it knew we would look. On the contrary, mon ami, Poirot murmured, not lifting his eyes from the gravel. They wished us to look. The print was too perfect, too deep. A real child running would leave a trail, not one solitary print. No, this was pressed in with the shoe we found in the nursery, but why press it so deep? To hide something else, perhaps. He rose and turned his attention to the ivy that clothed the wall like a shabby green coat. The plant was ancient, thick as my wrist in places, and it had been recently disturbed, leaves torn, some of the stems snapped. Poirot parted the curtain of leaves carefully and gave a soft exclamation. Regardez! Fibers caught on the thorns, green wool the same as we found in the chain clasp, and here, He held up a wisp of black lace, delicate as a spider's web. Part of a cap, I think. Mrs. Inglethorpe's cap. I stared at him. You think the housekeeper climbed down 20 feet in the dark? I think someone wishes us to think so, he corrected. But let us test the strength of this ivy. He seized a thick stem and swung his weight on it. The ivy held. He climbed 3 feet, 4, until he was level with the bedroom window. Then deliberately, he let himself drop back to the ground with cat-like grace. Possible, he said, brushing leaves from his coat. For a desperate person, very possible. But notice, these lower leaves are crushed as though by a heavier body. Someone climbed up or down, carrying something. Or someone. He knelt again and began working his way along the base of the wall. Suddenly he froze. Hastings, come here. I hurried over. He was staring at a patch of mud where the gravel met the flower bed. There, half hidden by a clump of Michaelmas daisies, lay a small patent leather child's shoe, the mate to the one in the nursery. But this one buckle was broken, and the inside was stained dark with what could only be blood. Poirot picked it up with his handkerchief. Lady Eleanor's blood? Or the doctor's? I whispered. Both, perhaps. But this shoe was not worn by a child. See the imprint of an adult instep. Someone put it on over their own shoe to make the print. Then in haste, lost the shoe when climbing. He slipped the shoe into an envelope. Now we have a trail. The ivy was used, yes, but not to escape. To enter. The murderer entered by the window after the struggle. Trevelyan fled down the ivy with the locket. Then he came back later to search for the compartment. That is when he lost the shoe. I was trying to piece it together when a voice rang out behind us. What the devil are you two playing at in my sister-in-law's flower bed? Colonel Blake strode around the corner of the house, shotgun broken over his arm, face like thunder. Poirot straightened, calm as ever. We discover how the murderer left the house, mon colonel. You have news of the doctor? Blake's eyes flicked to the ivy. No sign of the cad. The Moors swallowed him. Good riddance. But I found this in the chapel. He held out a scrap of green quilted silk, torn from the doctor's dressing gown, caught on the thorns of the rose bush by the chapel door, and on the flagstones inside. Blood. Fresh blood. Poirot took the silk. The doctor went to the chapel, to pray, or to hide the locket. Blake's laugh was ugly. Pray? That devil was no prayer. He went to meet someone. And the locket is gone. The altar cloth was disturbed. I think he passed it to an accomplice. Poirot's eyes narrowed. You think there was an accomplice? Blake's face twisted. I know there was. And I think it was the girl, Daphne, the bastard. She knew about the will. She wanted it all. She strangled Eleanor, then let the doctor take the blame. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the fog. That is a serious accusation, Colonel. It's the truth. I've watched her these months. Watching. Waiting. Like a vulture. Eleanor was going to acknowledge her. Give her everything. I was to get nothing. Nothing after Gerald died for king and country. She did it. And she's laughing at us all. Poirot was very still. You hate her, mon colonel. Blake spat. I hate what she represents. A stain on the family name. Poirot nodded slowly. Thank you, mon colonel. You have been most illuminating. Blake stared at him for a long moment, then shouldered his gun and strode away. Poirot watched him go. Now we know, he said quietly. The hate that was hatred, the hate that strangled. He looked at the shoe in his hand. The ivy lied, the footprints lied, but the hate, that speaks true. From the chapel bell tolled once, though no hand had touched the rope. And from the open window above us, very faintly, came the voice of a child singing, Oranges and lemons, say the bells of St. Clement's. You owe me 5 farthings. Say the bells of St. Clement's. The song stopped, then clear and terrible. When will you pay me? Say the bells of Old Bailey. Poirot looked up at the window. Soon, he said very softly. Very soon, and the fog rolled back in like a curtain. Chapter 7. The Speaking Tubes. That evening at 7 o'clock precisely, Poirot assembled the household in the great hall beneath the stern gaze of 3 centuries of Ravencrofts. The fog had returned thicker than ever. It pressed against the tall windows like wet wool, and every candle flame trembled as though afraid. Colonel Blake stood with his back to the enormous fireplace, a tumbler of whiskey in one hand and his other clenched at his side. Mrs. Inglethorpe sat rigid on a carved settle, black bombazine gleaming like a beetle's wing, her keys laid before her like a challenge. Daphne Wilde had taken the furthest, chair small and pale, hands folded in her lap as though in prayer. Dr. Trevelyan was still missing. The moor had swallowed him whole. Poirot stood alone in the center of the turkey carpet, a diminutive figure in perfect evening dress, hands clasped behind his back, the firelight glinting on the patent leather of his shoes. Mesdames, Messieurs, he began, voice soft yet carrying to every corner of the vaulted chamber. Tonight, Hercule Poirot will speak the truth of this house. Not the truth of ghosts, though ghosts have been busy. Not the truth of curses, though curses have been uttered. No. Tonight we speak the truth of murder. He paused, letting the silence stretch until it became unbearable. Lady Eleanor Ravencroft was strangled with the silver chain of her own locket between 11:40 and midnight 2 nights ago. Dr. Trevelyan has confessed to a struggle, to panic, to pulling the chain in order to silence her. He fled down the ivy with the locket, believing it contained a will that favored him. He is guilty of many things: seduction, forgery, the cruel imitation of a dead child's voice through the speaking tubes. But he is not guilty of deliberate murder. Colonel Blake snorted. Rubbish. He's confessed. He has confessed to what he believes happened, Poirot corrected gently. But the bruises on Lady Eleanor's throat tell another story. They are symmetrical, deep, the work of steady hands that pressed until life was extinguished. Trevelyan's hands shook with laudanum and terror. No. Someone entered that room after the doctor fled. Someone who hated Lady Eleanor enough to finish what panic had begun. He turned to Mrs. Inglethorpe. Madame, you have served this family for 50 years. You loved little Amelia as though she were your own. You polished her toys, you kept her nursery as a shrine. When Lady Eleanor brought home a living daughter, an illegitimate daughter, you feared the dead child would be forgotten. You feared the Ravencroft name would be dragged through the mud. You began the campaign of terror. Footsteps in the night, writing on slates the speaking tubes that carried a child's voice to every bedroom. You wished to drive your mistress mad so that any will favoring Daphne would be set aside as the work of a lunatic. Mrs. Inglethorpe's lips moved soundlessly. Her hands clutched the keys until the knuckles shone white. But you did not kill her, Poirot continued. You are guilty of cruelty, of malice, but not of murder. He turned to Daphne. Mademoiselle, you wished only recognition, love, your rightful place. You are innocent of everything except hope. Finally, he faced Colonel Blake. And you, mon colonel, you needed money. Your debts are mountainous. The old will left everything to you in trust for heirs of the body. When Lady Eleanor decided to acknowledge her living daughter, you lost everything. You discovered the secret of the locket, the birth certificate hidden inside. You knew that if the locket disappeared, Daphne would remain a bastard and you would inherit. Blake's face had gone a dark, ugly red. Lies. All lies. Poirot raised a small hand. From his pocket he produced the 2 tiny scraps of vellum he had rescued from the grate. These are corners of the will Lady Eleanor burned. the will that acknowledged Daphne Ravencroft as sole heiress. But there was another document in the locket. The original birth certificate. You needed both destroyed. You waited until Trevelyan had drugged her and fled in panic. Then you entered by the ivy, wearing Amelia's shoe over your own to leave the child's footprint. You found her still breathing. You finished the work with the chain. You took the locket, intending to destroy the certificate. But you could not open the secret compartment. In fury, you hurled the locket into the chapel font, hoping the holy water would somehow dissolve the evidence. He reached into his pocket again and drew out the sapphire locket, dark and accusing on its broken chain. I recovered it an hour ago. The compartment was forced by Dr. Trevelyan in his despair, but the certificate is intact. Daphne Amelia Ravencroft, born 12 of March 1912, daughter of Gerald and Eleanor Ravencroft. Signed, witnessed, legal. Blake's whiskey glass fell from his fingers and shattered on the hearthstone. You climbed the ivy twice, Poirot went on relentlessly. Once to kill. Once later to plant the second footprint in the bloodied shoe to convince us the doctor had returned. You tore your own coat on the chapel roses to implicate him further. You used the speaking tubes to keep the haunting alive, to keep us all terrified and looking in the wrong direction. Blake's hand dived into his pocket. The service revolver appeared as if by magic. "Stay back," he snarled. "I'll not hang for this." Poirot did not flinch. "You will not hang, mon colonel. You will be taken to Exeter jail tonight. Chief Inspector Japp is already on his way. But before he arrives, there is one last performance." He raised his voice slightly. "Now, if you please." From the minstrel's gallery above came the clear, sweet voice of a child, the same voice that had haunted the house for months. "Oranges and lemons, say the bells of St. Clement's. You owe me 5 farthings, say the bells of St. Clement's." Colonel Blake looked up, face contorted with terror. "Amelia," he whispered. The voice continued nearer now, coming from the very speaking tube beside the fireplace. "When I grow rich, say the bells of Shoreditch. Here comes a candle to light you to bed. Here comes a chopper to chop off your head." Blake screamed a high, animal sound and fired wildly at the grill. Plaster exploded. The revolver clicked on empty chambers. Strong arms seized him from behind. 2 constables in plain clothes, who had been concealed behind the arras, wrestled him to the ground. Blake fought like a madman, cursing, weeping, calling on Amelia to forgive him. Poirot watched calmly as the colonel was handcuffed. "You see," he said quietly, "the speaking tubes work both ways. A small boy from the village, well paid and well rehearsed, has been hidden in the attic since this morning. The ghosts of Ravencroft Manor were always living voices, mon colonel. Yours most of all." Blake was dragged away, still shouting that the child would curse him forever. The hall fell silent. Daphne rose slowly and came to Poirot. Tears shone on her cheeks, but her eyes were steady. "It is finished?" she asked. "It is finished," Poirot replied. "The house may sleep now." From the speaking tube came one last sound. Not a child's voice, but the soft, exhausted sigh of a woman long at rest. And somewhere, very far away, the fog began to lift. Chapter 8. The Man on the Moor. Colonel Blake was taken away at dawn. The 2 constables bundled him into a black Maria that looked absurdly modern against the Gothic bulk of Ravencroft Manor. He did not struggle any longer. The fight had gone out of him the moment the handcuffs clicked shut. He seemed smaller, as though the regimented pride that had held him upright for 50 years had finally deserted him. When the car lurched down the drive, he stared straight ahead, eyes fixed on nothing, repeating under his breath the same words over and over. "She'll come for me on the moor. Amelia will come." The fog swallowed the car, and that was the last any of us saw of Colonel Reginald Blake. Poirot watched from the front steps, hands clasped behind his back, mustache impeccable even at 6 in the morning. When the sound of the engine had died away, he turned to me with a small, tired smile. "And now, mon ami, we have one last ghost to lay." "Blake confessed," I said. "It's finished." Poirot shook his head. "Blake confessed to hatred, to climbing the ivy, to finishing what Trevelyan began in panic. But he did not confess to everything. There is still the matter of Dr. Miles Trevelyan, who has been missing since yesterday afternoon. A man does not simply vanish from Dartmoor in November, Hastings, not unless someone helps him vanish." A coldness settled in my stomach. "You think he's dead?" "I think," Poirot said quietly, "that we must find him before the moor does." We set out at first light, Poirot, myself, and 2 local constables who knew the paths. Daphne insisted on coming. She was pale but resolute, wrapped in a dark coat with the recovered locket now hanging openly at her throat. Mrs. Inglethorpe remained behind to lock up the speaking tubes and, I suspect, to weep in the nursery for the child she had loved too fiercely. The moor was a treacherous sea of bronze bracken and black peat, treacherous bogs hidden beneath innocent-looking grass. A thin mist still clung to the hollows. Every tor loomed and vanished like a mirage. Somewhere a raven croaked, the only sound in the vast silence. Poirot walked with his stick probing the ground, eyes flicking left and right. After 20 minutes, he stopped beside a patch of crushed heather. "See, 2 sets of footprints, one heavy military boots, Blake's perhaps from yesterday. The other lighter, erratic. The doctor barefoot or in bedroom slippers running for his life." The trail led westward toward the old tin workings. We followed it for nearly a mile past the ruined engine house where miners had once dragged tin from the earth, until the prints suddenly ended at the edge of a narrow stream. Poirot knelt. "He was carried from here. See the deeper impressions. 2 men, one on either side, dragging something heavy between them." I felt the chill deepen. Blake had already been arrested. "Exactly," Poirot said grimly. "Someone else wanted the doctor silenced." We cast about like hounds. One of the constables found it first, a scrap of green quilted silk caught on a gorse bush dark with blood. Trevelyan's dressing gown again. 10 yards farther, on the ground, fell away into a disused mine shaft, its mouth hidden by brambles. A foul stench rose from the darkness. Poirot produced an electric torch. The beam stabbed downward. 20 feet below, crumpled like a broken doll, lay Dr. Miles Trevelyan. He was not dead. His eyes were open, fixed on the circle of gray sky above. His right leg was twisted at an impossible angle, and blood had matted his hair, but he still breathed. Shallow, ragged breaths that stirred the dust on his lips. Daphne gave a low cry and would have climbed down had Poirot not restrained her. "Careful, mademoiselle. The sides are treacherous." We lowered a rope. The constables descended, fashioned a sling, and hauled the doctor up. He was conscious, barely, and when he saw Poirot, his cracked lips tried to form words. "Not Blake," he whispered. "Blake hated her. But he didn't push me. Someone else, someone who knew. I was coming back, for the locket." Poirot bent close. "Who, docteur? Give me the name." Trevelyan's eyes rolled toward Daphne, then past her, to the figure who had appeared silently at the edge of the clearing. Mrs. Inglethorpe. She stood quite still, black dress soaked with mist, the bunch of keys at her waist catching the thin light like a cluster of tiny knives. Her face was utterly without color, but her eyes burned with the same fierce devotion I had seen when she polished Amelia's toys. "I heard the colonel confess," she said quietly. "I heard him say he strangled my lady, and I thought if the doctor lived, he would tell a different story, that it was panic, not murder, that the colonel acted to protect the family name. I could not let that happen. Amelia deserved justice. Poirot rose slowly. So you followed Dr. Trevelyan when he escaped his room. You met him on the moor. You struck him with the walking stick you always carry for rheumatism. You and the gardener's boy dragged him here and threw him down the shaft, believing the fall would finish him. Mrs. Inglethorpe lifted her chin. I have served this house for 50 years. I nursed Miss Amelia through the fever. I held her when she died. Lady Eleanor betrayed her memory by bringing that girl here. She looked at Daphne with pure loathing. I would do it again, Trevelyan's voice rasped from the ground. She begged me to end her own life. After Amelia died, I refused. She never forgave me, said I let her child die. Mrs. Inglethorpe smiled then, a terrible, gentle smile. My lady is with her daughter now, and soon the doctor will be silent forever. She reached into the pocket of her bombazine skirt and drew out a small brown bottle, the twin of the laudanum bottle from Lady Eleanor's room. Enough here for 2, she said simply. I have kept it for myself, in case the police came too soon. Before anyone could move, she uncorked the bottle and swallowed the contents in 3 swift gulps. Poirot lunged, but it was too late. She folded to the ground as neatly as a marionette with its strings cut, eyes already glazing. The constable knelt, felt for a pulse, shook his head. Daphne was weeping silently. I felt suddenly sick. Poirot stood over the 2 bodies, one broken on the heather, one already cooling, and for once the little man looked old. 2 deaths for pride, he said softly. 2 deaths for love turned inside out. The ghosts of Ravenscroft were never children, Hastings. They were the living, devouring themselves. Far away, a church bell began to toll the hour, and the mist, as though satisfied at last, began to lift from the moor. Chapter 9. The Order of Things. Chief Inspector Japp arrived from Scotland Yard just as the sun finally broke through the clouds, a pale, reluctant November sun that seemed almost embarrassed to shine on so much misery. He stepped out of his car with the brisk, no-nonsense air of a man who has seen every kind of human folly and is faintly annoyed by all of them. Well, Poirot, he said, shaking hands, you've made a proper mess of my weekend, haven't you? 2 prisoners, 1 suicide, and a doctor at death's door. The local superintendents having kittens. Poirot permitted himself a small smile. My dear Japp, the kittens were already born. I have merely named them. We gathered in the library, Japp, Daphne, myself, and Dr. Trevelyan, who had been carried back on an improvised stretcher, and now lay propped on the sofa, swathed in blankets, his broken legs splinted. His face was the color of old parchment, but his eyes were clear. The local doctor had pumped laudanum into him for the pain, and it had the curious effect of making him almost serene. Mrs. Inglethorpe's body had been taken away. The housekeeper's keys lay on the mantel like a relic. Poirot stood before the fire, hands clasped behind his back, the flames turning his shadow into a dancing imp on the books behind him. Let us put the order of things, he said quietly. The truth, like a watch, must have every cog in place, or it will not tick. He began. 10 years ago, little Amelia Ravenscroft dies. Lady Eleanor, mad with grief, consults a medium who tells her a soul can be captured in sapphire at the moment of death. She buys the great stone, seals within it a miniature and a lock of hair. And unknown to anyone, the original birth certificate of the child she had been forced to give up in Switzerland. She believes she has saved her daughter's soul. In reality, she has imprisoned her own heart. Enter Dr. Miles Trevelyan 5 years ago. He becomes physician, then lover. He sees the ruin of the estate, the wasting of a great fortune on mediums and seances. He persuades Lady Eleanor to make a new will, leaving everything to medical research, specifically his own sanatorium. But he is weak. He begins to stage hauntings using the old speaking tubes, chalk on slates, cold hands in the dark. Anything to keep her dependent on his sedatives and his protection. Enter Colonel Blake 6 months ago. Ruined, desperate, expecting to inherit under the old will. He discovers the existence of Daphne. Lady Eleanor has begun to speak of acknowledging her. Blake is furious. The Ravencroft name, the fortune, everything must stay pure. Enter Mrs. Inglethorpe, who has loved Amelia as her own and sees Daphne as a living insult to the dead child's memory. 3 weeks ago, Lady Eleanor finds the courage to tell Trevelyan she is changing the will back, this time to Daphne. She shows him the locket's secret compartment, the birth certificate. Trevelyan panics. He increases the laudanum. He intensifies the hauntings. The night of the murder. 11:30 p.m. Trevelyan enters her room with a heavy dose. She is already confused, half dreaming. He tries to persuade her to sign yet another will favoring him. She refuses. She laughs at him. She has discovered his tricks with the speaking tubes. She threatens exposure. They struggle. He seizes the chain to silence her, pulls. She loses consciousness. He believes her dead. In panic, he tears the locket free, flees down the ivy, meaning to destroy the certificate later. But she is not dead. Only deeply unconscious from the drug. 11:55 p.m. Colonel Blake, who has been listening at the door, he has suspected Trevelyan for weeks, enters. He finds his sister-in-law still breathing, the chain loose about her neck. He sees his chance. With steady hands, he pulls the chain tight until there is no more breathing. Hatred gives him strength. He takes the locket. Now he will destroy the proof of Daphne's legitimacy and let Trevelyan take the blame. He climbs down the ivy, plants the child's footprint with Amelia's shoe to suggest the ghost walks, and hides the locket in the chapel font. Midnight. Mrs. Inglethorpe hears the one muffled cry. She finds the door locked. Blake has locked it behind him. By the time it is forced, Lady Eleanor is dead. The locket gone. Trevelyan is seen running across the lawn in his green dressing gown. Blake makes certain of that by shouting, "Stop, thief!" from a window. The next day, Trevelyan, realizing the certificate is not in the locket after he finally forces it open, returns secretly to search the chapel. Blake follows him, strikes him, and with the gardener's boy, whom he terrorizes into silence, throws the unconscious doctor down the mine shaft. Yesterday morning, Mrs. Inglethorpe, having heard Blake's confession and believing he acted to protect the family name, decides the doctor must not live to contradict the story of premeditated murder. She follows Trevelyan when he crawls out of the shaft during the night. Laudanum and desperation lend wings even to broken legs, and finishes what Blake began. But she cannot bring herself to strike the final blow. Instead, she offers him the laudanum bottle for the pain. He refuses. She drinks it herself rather than face disgrace. Poirot paused. The library was utterly silent except for the crackle of the fire. Dr. Trevelyan's voice was a thread. "I heard them. Blake and the boy, arguing in the chapel. Blake said, 'The bastard gets nothing. Amelia's memory gets everything.' Then the blow. Darkness. Daphne was weeping silently, the locket clutched in her hand. Jap cleared his throat. Blake's still insisting it was all him. Says the housekeeper acted alone in the attack on the doctor. Won't hear a word against her. Says she was the only decent one in the house." Poirot nodded sadly. He loved her, in his fashion. The fierce old retainer who kept the nursery sacred. He would protect her even now. He turned to Daphne. "Mademoiselle Lady Ravencroft, the estate is yours. The certificate is legal. Blake's confession and the recovered documents make it certain. You may keep the locket or bury it with your mother and sister. The choice is yours." Daphne looked at the sapphire in her palm. It caught the firelight and seemed for a moment to hold a flicker of blue flame. "I think," she said softly, "Amelia would want to be free." She crossed to the French windows, opened them, and hurled the locket far into the night. It flashed once against the stars and vanished into the moor. Behind us, Dr. Trevelyan gave a long, shuddering sigh and slipped into unconsciousness, whether from weakness or relief, none could tell. Japp stood up. "Well, Poirot, you've tied it up neatly enough, though I'll be damned if I understand why people can't just shoot one another cleanly in the library like civilized folk." Poirot's eyes twinkled for the first time in days. "Because, mon cher Japp, the English prefer poison hauntings and speaking tubes. It is so much more tasteful." And somewhere in the walls of Ravenscroft Manor a last faint sigh seemed to echo through the speaking tubes, the sound of a house finally exhaling a grief it had held for 10 long years. The ghosts were gone. Chapter 10. The Light That Lingers. 3 days after Mrs. Inglethorpe drank the laudanum on the moor, Ravenscroft Manor looked almost ordinary in the weak winter sunshine. The fog had gone for good. The sky was a clear, hard blue, and the ravens that had wheeled and screamed over the roof for years seemed to have flown elsewhere. The house no longer breathed. It simply stood, old, tired, and finally quiet. I found Poirot in the library, standing before the portrait of little Amelia. The child's painted eyes, which had once seemed to follow one about the room with accusation, now looked merely innocent. Daphne had ordered the nursery stripped that morning. The toys were to be given to the village orphanage, the rocking horse sold, the slate thrown into the lake. She could not bear to keep Amelia a prisoner any longer. "She was 6, Poirot said softly without turning. 6 years old, and she has ruled this house for 10. That is power, Hastings, the power of the helpless." Daphne entered then, carrying a small parcel wrapped in black silk. She had changed since the night Blake was taken away. The violet shadows under her eyes remained, but there was a straightness to her shoulders that had not been there before. She wore a simple gray dress, and at her throat, nothing. The locket was gone forever, sunk somewhere in the peat where no hand would ever find it. "I have something for you both," she said. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the effort it cost her. She unwrapped the parcel. Inside lay 2 objects: a small silver christening cup engraved with the name Amelia Geraldine Ravenscroft, 1919, and a photograph, Lady Eleanor on the day of Daphne's secret birth, holding a newborn wrapped in Swiss lace, her face radiant with exhausted joy. "The cup was Amelia's," Daphne said. "My mother kept it on her dressing table always. She used to fill it with primroses in spring and say, 'One for each daughter.' I want you to have it, Monsieur Poirot. You gave me back my name. Let this remind you that names matter." Poirot took the cup with infinite gentleness, turning it in his small hands so the engraved ravens caught the light. "And the photograph?" he asked. "That is for Captain Hastings," she said, handing it to me. "Because you have written of so many sorrows. Perhaps one day you will write of a joy that came too late." I could not speak. I simply bowed. Dr. Trevelyan died that afternoon. He never regained full consciousness after the library reconstruction. The local doctor said the combination of the fall, exposure, and the laudanum he had swallowed in despair on the moor was too much for a constitution already undermined by years of ether and sleepless nights. He slipped away at 3 o'clock, just as the sun reached the window of the guest room where he lay. Daphne was with him at the end. She told us later that his last words were not a confession or a plea, but a name, Eleanor's, spoken with the surprise of a man who has opened a door expecting darkness and found light instead. We buried him the next morning in the little churchyard beside Lady Eleanor and Amelia. Only 4 of us attended, Daphne, Poirot, myself, and the vicar, who had known the family since he was a curly-headed curate. Mrs. Inglethorpe was laid to rest the same day, in the servants' corner with her keys placed upon her breast as she had requested in the short note she left behind. "I have kept the house safe for 50 years, she had written in her crabbed Victorian hand. "I go now to keep Miss Amelia company, forgive an old woman her fierce love." Blake hanged himself in Exeter jail 2 weeks later with a strip torn from his army greatcoat. He left no note. The inquest returned verdicts of murder against Blake, misadventure against Trevelyan, and suicide whilst of unsound mind against Mrs. Inglethorpe. The newspapers called it the Curse of Ravenscroft Manor, and printed photographs of the house looking as sinister as possible. Daphne refused all interviews. Within a month, the journalists grew bored and moved on to a cabinet minister's mistress. Poirot and I left on a bright, frost-cold morning in December. The Rolls, now Daphne's Rolls, took us to the station. She stood on the steps in a dark fur coat, the wind whipping her hair free from its pins, and for a moment she looked exactly like her mother in the portrait above the stair. "You will come back?" she asked. Poirot bowed over her hand. "When the primroses bloom, ma chère. I have promised myself a pilgrimage to see how the christening cup filled." She smiled then, the first real smile I had seen on her face. "I shall hold you to that, Monsieur Poirot." The train journey home was silent for a long while. London's smoke felt almost welcoming after the clean, savage air of the moor. At last I could bear it no longer. "Poirot," I said, "do you believe any of it? The soul in the sapphire, Amelia walking, that sort of thing?" He considered, twirling his mustache thoughtfully. "I believe," he said at last, "that love is the most powerful force in the universe, Hastings. Stronger than death, stronger than reason. It can keep a house imprisoned for 10 years. It can drive a woman to poison, a soldier to murder, a doctor to madness. And it can sometimes, just sometimes, set the imprisoned free." He took the little silver cup from his pocket and turned it so the light ran across the engraving. "Regard this cup. Empty now, but in spring it will hold primroses again. 2 daughters' worth. That is not superstition, mon ami. That is miracle enough for Hercule Poirot." Outside the window, the suburbs of London slid past, rows of neat houses with Christmas lights already twinkling in the dusk. Ordinary, safe, utterly rational. I thought of Ravenscroft Manor standing open to the wind, its ghosts finally gone, its secrets buried with the dead. And I thought of a sapphire lying somewhere in black peat, dark as midnight, holding nothing now but a memory. The train pulled into Paddington. Poirot stood, buttoned his coat, and picked up his cane. "Come, Hastings. London awaits, and somewhere in this city, no doubt, another soul is preparing to commit a murder most foul. But tonight we have earned our rest." He paused at the compartment door. "Though I confess," he added softly, "I shall miss the speaking tubes, such excellent acoustics. One could almost believe a child's voice might travel forever through the walls of time." He smiled at my expression. "But no, the dead are silent at last, and the living must speak for them." And with that, Hercule Poirot stepped down onto the platform, immaculate as ever, into the roaring living chaos of London. Behind us, somewhere far to the southwest, the moor lay quiet under frost, waiting for spring. Waiting for primroses.